The wagon sat at the edge of the schoolyard, tilted left where the rear wheel had come off its axle, and the driver was already walking toward the saloon before the dust had settled from his boots. 7 children stood in the cold morning air, looking at the thing, the way children look at a problem that belongs to someone else, which is to say with interest, but without urgency. And the woman standing among them, with a crate of quilts balanced against her hip, was not their teacher, and not their mother, and not anyone the town of Harlan Crossing had decided to account for yet. Her name was Norah Voss, and she had arrived in Harlan Crossing 11 days earlier, on the same stage that brought the mail and a crate of window glass for the mercantile. And she had been treated with roughly the same interest as the glass, which is to say people were glad it existed, but did not particularly want to carry it home. She had set up a table at the Saturday market with 12 quilts folded and stacked and priced at what she believed was fair, which was $2 apiece. And the women of Harlan Crossing had come by and lifted the corners and set them down again, and said things to each other in voices built for distance. The quilts were double-stitched with a running feather pattern she had learned from a woman in Missouri who had learned it from her grandmother, and the batting was wool she had carded herself, and they were the warmest quilts in that county by any reasonable measure. But reasonable measures were not what the Saturday market ran on. What it ran on was whether you were known, and Norah Voss was not known, and so the quilts sat, and the women passed, and by the end of the morning, the only thing she had sold was a potholder to a man who felt sorry for her, and she had seen the feeling on his face and taken his coin anyway because she needed it. She had walked back to her rented room above the feed store with the crate still full and set it down and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window for a while. She was 31 years old. She had been a wife once, briefly, to a man who had gone west to find silver and found instead a fever that kept him. She had been a daughter, longer, to parents who had kept a dry goods store in Abilene until a bad winter and a worse spring took the store and then took them, one after the other, within the same calendar year. She had grown up in a church orphanage after that, which had given her 2 things she still carried: a knowledge of how to make something warm from almost nothing, and a durable patience with the way people looked at her when they had already decided what she was. She had not fallen apart at the market. She had not fallen apart on the bed either. She had pulled the crate back out and counted the quilts, and made a note in a small leather-bound book she kept for accounts. And then she had gone to sleep. That was 11 days ago. Now she was standing in the schoolyard with a crate of unsold quilts and 7 cold children, and a broken wagon, and the temperature was dropping in the particular way it drops on the eastern Colorado plain when the sky goes the color of pewter, and the wind comes down off the ridge without bothering to slow for anything in its path. She looked at the sky. She looked at the children. She looked at the wagon wheel lying in the frozen mud, like something that had given up. The children were looking at her now. She was not their teacher, but she was the only adult present, and children understand the geometry of that arrangement, even when they cannot name it. She set the crate down. She counted the quilts. There were 12. There were 7 children. She opened the crate and began pulling quilts out and wrapping them around small shoulders, one at a time, tucking the edges in the way you tuck something you mean to hold. By the time Caleb Marsh came round the corner of the livery, driving his buckboard back from the timber yard with a load of pine planking stacked and roped behind him, what he saw was 7 children bundled in quilts of blue and gold and deep red standing in a rough circle in the schoolyard, and a woman in a brown coat kneeling in the mud beside the broken wheel with her hands on the axle, not fixing it, just assessing it, her chin level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. He pulled the horses up. He sat there a moment. Then he climbed down. He was 38 years old, Caleb Marsh, and he ran a carpentry operation out of a workshop behind his house 2 miles east of town, and he had a daughter named Lily, who was 6, and a son named Thomas, who was 9. and he had been carrying the weight of both of them alone for 2 years since their mother had gone. Not to death, but to a life she wanted more than the one she had, which was its own kind of gone, and in some ways harder to explain to children. He was a man who had carried too much for too long, long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight. He was not looking for anything. He had not been looking for anything for some time. He looked at the wheel. He looked at the sky. He looked at the woman in the brown coat. She stood up when he approached. She did not ask for help. She said, in a plain voice, the plain fact of the situation, which was that the axle pin was sheared, and the driver had gone, and the children needed to be somewhere warm before the weather came down. He nodded. He looked at the sky again. The sky confirmed what they both already knew. He said he could take the children in 2 loads to the schoolhouse if she could manage the second group while he made the first run. He said it the way you say something practical to someone you have assessed as capable, which was a different thing than the way most people in Harlan Crossing had spoken to her in 11 days. And she noticed the difference the way you notice a door that opens easily after a long run of stuck ones. She said that was fine. He said he had seen the quilts at the market. She waited. He said they were good work. She said thank you, and nothing else. He loaded 4 of the children onto the buckboard and clicked the horses forward. And she stood with the remaining 3, and the crate and the broken wagon and the pewter sky. And she pulled the last quilt out of the crate and put it around the smallest child, a girl of about 5 with red mittens and a serious expression. And then she stood in the cold with nothing between her and the wind but her brown coat. And she waited, which was something she was practiced at. He came back in 20 minutes. He loaded the last 3 children and the crate, and she climbed up beside him on the bench, and he turned the buckboard toward the schoolhouse. And the first flakes of snow came down as they moved, small and dry and businesslike, the advance party of something much larger, gathering itself behind the ridge. They did not speak on the drive. There was nothing that needed saying that could be said in the time they had, and neither of them was the kind of person who spoke to fill silence. The snow came harder. He drove. When they had delivered the children to the school teacher, and the school teacher had taken the quilts inside, and the children were warm, and the door was shut, he stood by the buckboard, and she stood a few feet away. And the snow was coming down in earnest now, the kind of snow that means it. He said he had a workshop. He said he had more work than he could manage alone. He said he was not offering charity. He was offering wages for honest work, keeping accounts, sanding finished pieces, managing correspondence, and that she was welcome to say no, and he would drive her back to town the same as he would drive her out to the property if she said yes. She looked at him. She looked at the snow. She said, "What kind of wages?" He named a figure. It was a fair figure. She said she could also cook, and she was not afraid of hard work. He said he had 2 children who needed feeding, and a house that needed managing, and that if she was willing to take that on as well, the wages would reflect it. She said all right. He said all right. They drove out to the property through the thickening snow, and by the time they arrived the blizzard had closed down behind them like a curtain. And Harlan Crossing was somewhere back in the white, and the pine trees along the ridge were bending in the wind, and the workshop light was on because Thomas had gone out to feed the animals and left it burning, and the house was cold because no one had been there to keep it. And Norah Voss climbed down from the buckboard with her crate of quilts and walked into the house and started a fire. She had the fire going and the kettle on before either child came in from the barn. Thomas came first, 9 years old and serious in the way of a boy who has taken on the habit of being useful, because he understood that useful things were kept. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with an expression that was not hostile, exactly, but was not open either. It was the expression of someone checking the horizon for weather. She did not explain herself to him. She said there was hot water coming and asked if he had finished with the animals. He said he had. She said good and turned back to the stove. Lily came in behind him, 6 years old and still wearing her coat, and she stopped in the doorway beside her brother and looked at Norah and then looked at the fire and then looked at Norah again. And something in the child's face was simpler than her brother's. More direct, the way young children are direct before they learn that directness costs something. Lily said, "Are you staying?" Norah said, "For a while." Lily said, "Good," and went to hang up her coat. Thomas watched all of this and said nothing, which was not the same as being satisfied, but it was a beginning. Caleb came in last, stomping snow from his boots in the doorway, and he looked at the fire and at the kettle and at the 2 children already settling at the table. And he looked at Norah's back as she moved around the kitchen with the particular efficiency of a woman who has cooked in many different kitchens and knows how to read a new one quickly, finding things without being told where they were, making do with what was there. He hung up his coat and sat down at the table and said, nothing about the fire or the kettle, or the fact that the kitchen was warm for the first time in longer than he could easily say. Nothing said about any of it. She said nothing about it either. The blizzard ran for 2 days. They were 2 days of close quarters and careful navigation, the way it always is when strangers are thrown together by weather and necessity and are too proud and too private to be anything but civil, which in its own way is a kind of intimacy, the intimacy of people behaving well under pressure. Norah cooked. She found the larder and assessed it and made what it offered into 3 meals a day, plain meals, solid and hot, the kind of food that does not announce itself but that you notice when it is absent. She kept the fire. She sat in the evenings with the account books Caleb brought her from the workshop and worked through them with a pencil and the small leather book she kept for her own accounts. And she found 3 errors that had been costing him money for the better part of a year, and she marked them plainly and set the books on the corner of the table where he would find them. He found them the second morning. He sat with them for a long time. He did not say anything about the errors. He set the books back on the shelf and went out to the workshop, and she heard the sound of the plane running over pine boards, long, steady strokes, the sound of a man working through something. Thomas thawed slowly. It happened in increments too small to point at, the way ice thaws on a south-facing slope, not all at once but steadily, 1 degree at a time. On the second day he came and stood near her while she was making bread and watched her hands without saying anything. And she let him watch without making it a moment. And eventually he said his mother had made bread differently, and she said there were many ways to make bread and they were mostly all right. And he thought about that and then asked if he could try the kneading, and she moved aside and let him try it. And he was not good at it, but he was earnest about it. And she said he had the right idea and showed him the heel of the hand push without making a lesson of it. And he did it again, and it was better. And he looked at his hands afterward with a small private satisfaction that she did not comment on. Lily had no thawing to do. Lily had arrived already thawed. She followed Norah through the house at a small distance, not underfoot but present, the way a cat is present. And she brought Norah things. A button she had found, a drawing she had made, a question about why snow was white and not some other color. And Norah answered each of these as they deserved, with full attention and plain words, and Lily stored each answer up with the seriousness of a child who is building something. On the 3rd day the blizzard broke, and the sun came out over a world gone entirely white and still. And Caleb saddled the horse and rode into Harlan Crossing to check on the property he kept there and to tell people the children were safe, because he understood that the school wagon's failure would have been known and questions would be circulating. Norah stayed and kept the house and finished the accounts and found a loose board in the hallway that had been catching the hem of her skirt and thought about it, and then left it alone because it was not her house to repair. He noticed the board when he came back. He did not say anything. He went to the workshop and came back with a hammer and 2 nails, and fixed it in 4 strokes. And she was in the kitchen when he did it, and heard the hammer and knew what it was, and she kept her hands in the bread dough and said nothing. Nothing said about the board. He said nothing about it either. That was how it went. The days accumulated the way days do when a routine is sound, one after another, each one slightly different from the last, but following the same shape, and the shape was the shape of a household that was working. She kept the accounts and managed the correspondence and sanded the finished pieces in the workshop on the afternoons when the children were at school. And she cooked and kept the fire and mended what needed mending, and he built things and delivered things and came home at the end of the day to a house that was warm and a table that was set, and neither of them made anything of it. The quilts were still in the crate. She had set the crate in the corner of the room she slept in, which was the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage, and she had not opened it. There was no market to sell them at, not in winter, and she had not decided what to do about that yet. The crate sat in the corner, and she saw it every morning when she woke, and every night when she went to sleep. And it was a reminder of something she had not yet resolved, though she could not have said precisely what. The town of Harlan Crossing had opinions about the arrangement, which was not surprising, because the town of Harlan Crossing had opinions about most arrangements. And this one had the particular appeal of involving a man who kept to himself and a woman no one knew, which was the kind of combination that produced opinions the way wet wood produces smoke, abundantly and with some irritation to the eyes. The opinions were organized and distributed primarily by a woman named Cecile Horn, who ran the dry goods counter at the mercantile and had a voice built for distance and a concern for the welfare of others that she kept prepared at home and brought out fresh each morning. Cecile Horn had been interested in Caleb Marsh in the particular way of a woman who has not acted on an interest but considers it hers by prior claim. And the arrival of a woman from nowhere who was now living in his house and cooking his meals and managing his accounts was not a development she received with equanimity. What Cecile Horn said to anyone who came to the dry goods counter in the weeks that followed was that it was a shame, really. A man like Caleb Marsh being taken advantage of by a woman who couldn't sell her quilts at market and needed somewhere warm to land, and that the children deserved better than a stranger in their kitchen, and that she had heard from someone reliable that Norah Voss had left Abilene under circumstances that did not reflect well on her character, though she was careful not to specify the circumstances because specificity would have required her to invent them, and she preferred to let the listener's imagination do that work. The town listened and stored it up, the way towns do for later. Norah heard some of it. You always hear some of it. She heard it from the feed store man when she came in for oats. A careful sideways version of it, delivered in the form of a question about how she was finding Harlan Crossing. And she heard it from the woman at the post office who sorted the mail with a particular deliberateness when Norah came in to collect the workshop correspondence, as if the letters needed to be inspected for character before being handed over. She heard it, and she set it aside, not because it didn't land, but because she had been setting things aside for a long time and she was practiced at it. She did not tell Caleb. He found out anyway, the way a man finds out things in a small town, which is sideways and all at once, from a remark made at the lumber yard by a man who thought he was passing on news and did not understand he was lighting a fuse. He came home that evening, and she had supper on the table, and the children were already eating, and he sat down and ate and said nothing. And she watched his face do what it did when he was working something through, which was very little on the surface and a great deal underneath. And she thought about asking and decided not to, because it was not yet the kind of thing she could ask. After the children were in bed, he came and stood in the kitchen doorway while she was washing the supper dishes, and he said, "I heard what Cecile Horn has been saying." She kept her hands in the water. He said, "I want you to know it doesn't change anything here." She looked at the window above the sink, which was dark and showed her own reflection, and his. Him in the doorway, her at the basin, the lamplight making everything soft. She said she appreciated that, He said he was sorry she was having to hear it. She said she had heard worse, and she meant it as a plain fact and not as a bid for sympathy, and he received it as the plain fact it was, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was not the end of what had been said. She found the cloth the next morning. It was folded on the corner of the work table in the workshop, a length of good cotton in a deep blue, enough for a dress, and there was no note because he was not a man who wrote notes. And she stood there holding it for a moment, and then she set it down and went back to the accounts. Nothing said about the cloth. She said nothing about it either. It was Lily who said the thing. It was a Sunday morning in late January, the kind of morning when the light comes in flat and gold through the east window, and the house is warm, and the smell of coffee is everywhere, and Norah was sitting at the kitchen table with the account books open, and Lily was sitting across from her drawing something on a piece of brown paper with a stub of charcoal, and Thomas was in the workshop with his father, which had become his habit on Sunday mornings, going out after breakfast and coming back with sawdust on his coat and a proprietary air about whatever was being built. Lily drew for a while in silence. Then she looked up at Norah with the directness she always had, that unguarded straight-on look that children have before they learn to angle their eyes away from the things they really want. She said, "You smell like Mama did." Norah went still. Lily said, "Not the same smell, just the same kind, like someone who lives here." She went back to her drawing. Norah sat with the account books open in front of her and looked at the page and did not see the numbers. Something had shifted in the room, in the quality of the air, in the way the light fell across the table, and she understood what it was, and she set it aside with great care, the way you set aside something you are not ready to look at directly, and she picked up her pencil and went back to the accounts. She heard the workshop door open and close. She heard boots on the porch. Caleb came in and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter, and she did not look up. And he did not speak, and Lily went on drawing, and the morning went on being what it was, golden and quiet, and changed. The trouble came in February, the way trouble often does, not with a warning, but with a knock on the door. The man who knocked was named Gerald Pruitt, and he was a land agent from a firm in Denver that had been buying up small properties along the ridge for a year and a half. And he had a document in his coat pocket that he said represented an offer on the Marsh property, and his manner was the manner of a man who considers an offer and a fait accompli to be roughly the same thing. He was not large and he was not loud, but he had the particular confidence of someone who believes that paper is more powerful than people, which in many cases is true, and he had learned to use that belief as a kind of leverage. He had also, it became clear, been in conversation with Cecile Horn, whose cousin owned the competing carpentry operation in the next town and who had reasons beyond gossip for wanting Caleb Marsh to leave Harlan Crossing. Caleb heard the man out. He took the document and read it. He set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Pruitt. He said the property was not for sale. Pruitt said the offer was generous, and the firm was patient, but not infinitely so, and that there were other pressures that could make the property more difficult to hold. And he said this in the way of a man implying something he does not intend to specify. Caleb said the property was not for sale. Pruitt looked at Norah, who was standing near the kitchen doorway, and he looked at her the way he looked at the document, as if she were a liability he was calculating. He said he had heard there were questions in town about the nature of the household, and that such questions, if they continued, could affect a man's business and standing, and that a clean sale and a fresh start somewhere else was sometimes the simplest resolution to a complicated situation. There was a silence. Caleb stood up from the table. He was not a large man in the way of men who use their size, but he was a man who had been building things with his hands for 20 years, and he was solid in the way of something well made. And when he stood up in a room, it was noticed. He said, "I'll tell you what the situation is. The situation is that this is my property and my household and my business, and none of those things are your concern, and I'd like you to take your document and go back to Denver and tell your firm that the Ridge properties are going to stay in the hands of the people who built them." Pruitt looked at him. He looked at Norah. He picked up his document and left. The door closed behind him, and the house was quiet. The fire was going. The coffee was still hot. Outside the window, the February light was thin and flat, and the snow on the ridge was very white against the pale sky. Norah said, "He'll go to Cecile Horn." Caleb said, "I know." She said, "She'll make it worse." He said, "I know that too." He stood there a moment, and she could see him working through something, and then he said, "I'm going to town tomorrow. I have a delivery to make to the schoolhouse. The new desks." She looked at him. He said, "I'd like you to come." She understood what he was saying. She said, "All right." They went to town the next morning with the buckboard loaded with 6 new pine desks, sanded smooth and finished with a clear oil that caught the light. And Norah sat beside him on the bench in her brown coat with the blue cloth made up into a dress underneath it, because she had made the dress in the evenings over the past 2 weeks, working by the lamplight after the children were in bed, and she had not said anything about it, and he had not asked. The street was busy for a Thursday morning. Word travels in a small town the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself, and the word had traveled that Caleb Marsh was coming in with the school desks, and people had found reasons to be on the main street at that particular hour, and Cecile Horn was among them, standing in front of the mercantile with 2 other women, and an expression of prepared concern. Caleb pulled the buckboard up in front of the schoolhouse and climbed down and began untying the ropes on the desks. And Norah climbed down on her side and came around and took the other end of the first desk, and they carried it in together, and then the second, and then the third. And by the 4th desk the schoolteacher had come out and was helping, and by the 5th desk 2 of the fathers who had been watching from the street had come over and were helping too, because that is the other thing about small towns, that when a man is doing honest work in plain sight, the honest people eventually come and help, and there were honest people in Harlan Crossing. There are honest people everywhere. They are just sometimes slow to move. When the last desk was in and the buckboard was empty, Caleb stood in the street, and the people who had gathered stood around him, and Cecile Horn was among them, and he looked at her in the plain way of a man who is not angry, but is finished with something, and he said, in a voice that carried without being raised, that Clara Voss had been keeping his accounts and his house and his children for 6 weeks, and that she had found errors in his books that had been costing him money for a year, and that she had wrapped 7 children in her own quilts in a blizzard, and stood in the cold herself to keep them warm, and that he would be grateful if the town would extend to her the same basic courtesy. It extended to anyone who worked hard and did right by the people around her. He said it plain. He did not say it as a speech. He said it the way you say a fact that you have decided to stop keeping to yourself. The street was quiet. Cecile Horn's expression did what expressions do when they are caught between their prepared position and the reality in front of them. She said nothing. The women beside her said nothing. The fathers who had helped carry the desks nodded in the way of men who have been waiting for something to be said and are relieved it has been. The schoolteacher, who was a woman named Ruth Adler, and who had been in Harlan Crossing for 12 years and knew its currents well, looked at Norah and said, "Those quilts are still in my schoolhouse. The children have been asking about them." Norah said she was glad they were being used. Ruth Adler said, "I think there are families in this town who would buy them if they knew what they were made of." Norah said she thought the same thing. Ruth Adler said, "Saturday market is in 3 weeks." Norah said she'd be there. Caleb stood beside her through all of this and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The kind that does not need words because the standing there is the words. They drove back out to the property in the afternoon light, the buckboard empty now, the horses moving at an easy pace through the snow-packed road. the ridge on their left going gold in the low sun. They did not speak much on the drive. There was a quality to the silence that was different from earlier silences, easier, the kind of silence that has earned itself. When they got back, Thomas was in the workshop finishing a small stool he had been building on his own, and Lily was on the porch with her coat on, watching a magpie in the pine tree at the edge of the yard, and the house was cold because no one had been there to keep it. But it was the kind of cold that a good fire resolves quickly. And Norah went in and started the fire and put the kettle on and heard Caleb come in behind her and hang up his coat. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. She had her back to him. She heard him not leave, which is a specific sound, the sound of a man standing still when he could be moving. She turned around. He said, "I've been thinking about what to say for a while, and I haven't found anything better than the plain version, so I'll give you that." She waited. He said, "I'm asking you to stay. Permanent. As my wife, if that's what you'd want. I know you came here with nothing settled, and I know you have your own plans, and I'm not asking you to give those up. I'm asking you to make them here, if you're willing. The children would be glad of it. I would be glad of it." He stopped. He said, "You don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer for as long as you need." She looked at him. She looked at the kitchen, at the fire she had just started, at the kettle beginning to warm, at the shelf where the account book sat with her pencil marks in them, at the hallway where the board no longer caught her hem. She thought about the crate of quilts in her room. She thought about the small leather book she kept for accounts. She thought about Lily saying, like someone who lives here, with a matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has already decided. She said, "Yes." She said, "That's what I want." He stood there a moment, and something moved across his face that was not pride and not relief, though it was close to both, something quieter than either. The thing that moves across a face when a weight you have been carrying for so long you forgot it was there is finally set down. He said, "All right." She said, "All right." The kettle began to sing. Thomas came in from the workshop with sawdust on his coat and looked at the two of them standing in the kitchen, and looked at the fire and looked at the table, and he said, "Is supper soon?" because he was 9 years old, and that was the most pressing question he had. And Norah said yes, it was soon, and he sat down and pulled off his boots and left them by the door in the way she had asked him to 3 weeks ago, and he had been doing ever since, without being asked again. Lily came in from the porch and announced that the magpie had a piece of red cloth in its beak, and she had watched it fly into the pine tree, and she believed it was building something, and Caleb said that was likely so, and Lily considered this information and said that she thought that was a good idea. Building something, and no one said anything to that because there was nothing to add to it. Cecile Horne did not come to apologize. That was not the kind of thing Cecile Horne did, and no one expected it. What she did was stop, which was as close to an apology as such people give, and the town understood it as such and moved on, the way towns do when they have witnessed something and filed it and are ready to talk about something else. Gerald Pruitt did not come back. The land firm sent a letter in March that Norah received and opened and read, and set on the corner of the table for Caleb. And he read it, and set it on the shelf, and did not respond to it. And after a time, the letters stopped coming, which was answer enough. The Saturday market came 3 weeks after the day on the main street, and Norah set up her table with 12 quilts and 4 more she had made in the evenings through February. 16 quilts in blue and gold, and deep red, and a new pattern she had been working on. A wide-running star that she had drafted from memory on brown paper by lamplight. And Ruth Adler came by first thing in the morning and bought 2. And the mothers of 4 of the 7 Blizzard children came and bought 1 each. And by noon there were 6 quilts left, and by the end of the afternoon there were 2, and those 2 she sold to a woman from the next town who had driven in specifically because she had heard about them, word traveling the way it does. She drove home with an empty crate and a full account book, and Caleb beside her on the bench, the children in the back of the buckboard, wrapped in the 2 quilts that had not sold. which were the two she had made first. The ones with the feather pattern she had learned in Missouri, and she had not sold them on purpose, though she had not said so, and he had not asked. By the time the frost settled in for good that autumn, the crate was gone. She had broken it down for kindling in September, when the morning started going cold, and fed it to the kitchen fire one plank at a time, and no one remarked on it, but she noticed the corner of the room where it had stood looked different without it, larger somehow, and she put a chair there instead, a small wooden chair that Thomas had made in the workshop under his father's instruction, not perfectly made, but made with care, and she set her mending basket on it, and that was where it stayed. The workshop had more work than it could manage. The school desk delivery had been seen by the right people, and the word had gone out. The way good word eventually goes out when the bad word has exhausted itself, and there were orders from 3 towns along the ridge by spring and a letter of inquiry from a hotel in Denver that Norah answered in her plain, careful hand, and which resulted in a contract for 10 room frames that kept the workshop busy through the summer. She kept the accounts in the small leather book, and then in a larger one when the small one filled up. And she kept the house and the children and her own work too. The quilts selling steadily at the Saturday market, through spring and into summer. The feather pattern and the running star and a new one she had designed herself. A pattern she called the ridge pattern, because that was what it looked like to her, the long, uneven line of the ridge against the winter sky. On a morning in October, Lily came into the kitchen where Norah was working and climbed up onto the chair by the window and looked out at the yard where Caleb and Thomas were splitting wood for the winter. The sound of the axe coming in, clean and regular, through the glass, and she watched them for a while with the serious attention she gave to things she found important. Then she said, without turning from the window, "Thomas says you're our mother now." Norah looked at her. Lily said, "I told him I knew that already." She climbed down from the chair and went back to whatever she had been doing, and Norah stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming in, and the sound of the axe outside and the smell of the bread she had in the oven. And she let herself feel what there was to feel, which was considerable, and then she went back to work. The cabin held its warmth that winter, not waiting for anyone. Not any more. The quilt she had made for the bed, the one in the ridge pattern, the deep blue and gold, was the last thing you saw when the lamp went out, the colors going dark one at a time, until the room was just the sound of the wind outside, and the warmth inside, and the particular quiet of a house that has found its shape and settled into it. The crate was ash by then. The account books were full. The chair by the wall held the mending basket, and the mending got done. And the step that had once caught her hem was solid underfoot, and the children grew, the way children do, steadily and then suddenly, and the workshop built things that stood, and the quilts kept people warm through the hard winters on the eastern Colorado plain, and Harlan Crossing went on being what it was, which was a town that had watched something happen and stored it up and would tell it differently later, the way towns always do, making it simpler and neater than it was, leaving out the cold and the mud and the crate of unsold quilts and the pewter sky, keeping only the part that made a good story. But the real story was this. A woman arrived in Harlan Crossing with 12 quilts and a leather account book and a durable patience built from a hard life, and the town looked at her and decided it knew what she was. And a blizzard came down off the ridge and showed them otherwise. And a man with a buckboard in a workshop and 2 children who needed someone drove her out to a house that was cold, and she started a fire. And that was the beginning of it, and the end of it was warm and solid and made to last. And that was the story of Clara Voss, a woman who arrived with a crate of quilts no one wanted and found, before the first winter was out, that she had built something no one could take from her. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.